The room was colder than usual. Not the kind of cold that makes you shiver, but the kind that settles deep into your chest, the kind that tells you something historic is about to happen. Courtroom 6A of the Federal District Courthouse was silent, almost too silent, as if the air itself had thickened, as if the walls polished marble trimmed with oak knew they were about to witness something that would echo across generations. Rows of wooden pews were already filled. Journalists, legal analysts, former lawmakers, and everyday citizens who had waited months just to be here. Some clutched notebooks, others clutched their chests. The judge's bench towered above them all, draped in shadows and authority. The seal of the United States loomed behind it, silent and unmoving, a symbol both proud and bruised. In the far left corner, an American flag stood perfectly still. Not a single fold moving through the central air hummed constantly. It was as if even the flag was holding its breath. Camera crews had set up 3 hours prior. Wires snaked across the carpet. Microphones hung from ceilings. Every news network in the world had eyes trained on this room, not for entertainment, but for judgment. Then came the sound heels clicking steadily across the marble floor. Not rushed, not uncertain, but deliberate, powerful, heavy with purpose. Heads turned, conversations halted mid-whisper, phones were lowered. Even the judge paused for a second, sensing a shift in gravity. She had arrived. Jasmine Crockett, wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, stepped into the courtroom with the quiet command of a woman who knew what was coming and who wasn't afraid of it. Her hands held a single red leather folder. It wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. The weight it carried wasn't physical. It was political. It was historical. It was constitutional. From the gallery, someone whispered, "That's her," and yes, it was her. The woman who'd gone from defending the voiceless in Texas courtrooms to now standing as the last wall between democracy and collapse. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. Her eyes locked into the defendant's table. And across the room, Donald Trump looked up, and for the briefest moment, something shifted behind his eyes. The storm hadn't hit yet, but the clouds had arrived. She didn't walk like a politician. She walked like a surgeon heading into an operating room, precise, focused, and aware that one wrong move could change everything. In her hands was a single red leather folder. It wasn't thick, it wasn't flashy, but in a room filled with powerful men, million-dollar attorneys, and marble walls that had heard decades of arguments, this folder was the most dangerous thing present. To most, it looked ordinary. To the cameras, it was just another prop in a high-profile trial. But to Jasmine Crockett, and soon to the rest of the world, it was a loaded weapon, one that didn't fire bullets, but facts. Inside that folder were 847 pages that had the potential to collapse a legacy, rewrite American political history, and send the 45th President of the United States to a prison designed for terrorists and traitors. Every step Jasmine took toward the prosecution's table echoed louder than the last. The floor didn't creak, but people swore they could hear her footsteps in their chest. She wasn't just walking, she was advancing. Like a verdict in motion, observers in the gallery leaned in. Trump's attorneys shifted in their seats. Even the judge narrowed her eyes slightly, as if the very sight of the red folder had shifted the gravity in the room. And maybe it had, because what Jasmine held wasn't just evidence, it was reckoning. The moment a system long bruised by wealth and whiteness would finally turn its face toward justice. Cold, clear, and final. Donald Trump sat at the defense table like a man clinging to the throne of a crumbling empire. His posture was upright, rehearsed. His suit, a custom-made Italian blend navy with gold pinstripes, spoke the language of wealth. His tie, a defiant red, rested perfectly across his chest, like a medal from a war he believed he had already won. To the cameras, he looked composed, unshaken. That trademark smirk still danced on the corner of his lips, the kind of smirk that once made headlines, split a nation, and bent reality to his will. But up close, just beneath the surface, the cracks had already formed. His eyes, usually fierce and calculating, flickered. Not the way a leader scans a battlefield, but the way a trapped man searches for an exit. His fingers tapped the table in an erratic rhythm, not confidence but nerves, not strategy but dread. He kept glancing at the red folder. Not long stares, just quick flickers like a child afraid to look under the bed, fearing what's already crawling out. From behind the room could only see the back of his head. But those sitting to his left, his lawyers, his closest advisors, could see the truth. The once immovable icon of political dominance was starting to shrink in real time. There were exactly 47 seconds left. 47 seconds before Jasmine Crockett would open that folder. 47 seconds before every lie, every backroom deal, every whispered phone call and classified secret would finally be dragged into the light. He had once controlled nuclear codes. He had once reshaped global alliances with a single tweet. But now in courtroom 6A, his fate rested in the hands of a woman he once dismissed as a nobody. The smirk was still there, but barely. It clung to his face like a dying echo of who he used to be. The empire hadn't fallen yet, but it was teetering. Before she ever stood in courtroom 6A, before she became a congresswoman, and long before she held the red folder that shook a nation, Jasmine Crockett was just a public defender in Texas walking into courtrooms where justice was too often a stranger. She defended the people no one else wanted to. Young black men arrested without cause, mothers charged with crimes they didn't commit, families broken apart by systems built to forget them. She didn't do it for applause. She did it because someone had to, and they hated her for it. There was a morning she'd never forget. It was summer, hot. The air was thick with anger. She had just walked out of court after getting charges dropped against a 19-year-old falsely accused of stealing a car. A white man in a suit, furious and red-faced, stepped in front of her on the courthouse steps. He spat right in her face, in front of cameras, in front of her client, in front of the world. She didn't flinch. She didn't wipe it away. She looked him dead in the eye and said, "If this is the cost of defending truth, we'll pay it every damn time." Later that night, she got an anonymous call telling her she'd better back off or else. That wasn't the first threat, and it wouldn't be the last. Her car was keyed. Her office was vandalized. She was followed, insulted, laughed at, but she kept showing up. Day after day, courtroom after courtroom, she stood up not just for her clients, but for a principle that justice doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to everyone. That fire, that rage, that unshakable sense of duty, it followed her all the way to Washington. It followed her to the halls of Congress. And on this day, it followed her into courtroom 6A. She didn't come to punish. She came to finish what she started years ago, to defend the people who had no voice, even if it meant going up against the loudest one in the country. They didn't just try to discredit her, they tried to erase her. Cable news hosts called her reckless radical, even unfit to speak. Editorials dismissed her as a headline chaser, a diversity pick, or worse, an angry black woman playing politics. Powerful men in expensive suits chuckled behind closed doors, mocking her rise as a fluke, saying she got lucky that she wouldn't last. They said her fire would burn out, that she'd be replaced, forgotten. But Jasmine Crockett was not fire. She was steel that had been forged in it. They underestimated her because she didn't come from an Ivy League law school, because she didn't throw fancy fundraisers at glass towers, because she didn't speak in polished poll-tested sound bites. She spoke with the weight of people who had nothing left to lose, with the pain of families who'd buried their children because justice showed up too late or not at all. What they didn't see was what happened behind the scenes, the all-nighters, the war room briefings, the endless pages of documents she studied line by line. Jasmine didn't walk into battles unarmed. She walked in overprepared because she knew they'd come at her harder. While others rehearsed their optics, she memorized court transcripts. While they hired stylists, she built legal strategies. While they underestimated her, she was already 10 steps ahead. She didn't fight to be seen. She fought because she refused to disappear. They tried to break her with labels, threats, and mockery, but all they did was sharpen her. The folder didn't look heavy, but it was, not in ounces or pounds, but in history, in consequence, in truth. 847 pages tightly bound, neatly color-tabbed, but there was no order that could soften what those pages held. Each line, each timestamp, each recorded call was a dagger, sharp, precise, and aimed directly at the heart of denial. Jasmine didn't hold it like evidence. She held it like a verdict. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. The room had already gone still, not silent like a lull, silent like a pressure drop before a hurricane, like the final breath before the avalanche breaks loose. From the gallery, you could hear a pen click, a throat clear, nothing else. Her fingers hovered above the clasp, and still she waited. She let the moment stretch, not out of drama, but out of respect, for what was about to be unleashed, for the names listed in those pages, for the evidence built over years, sometimes in secret, always in fear, for the agents who risked their lives, for the truth buried under layers of power and politics, finally clawing its way into the light. She opened the folder, and though she didn't speak a word, the whole courtroom inhaled, because they all knew once this folder opened, there was no going back. For years, he was the loudest voice in every room. He screamed over reporters, dominated rallies, interrupted debates, and drowned out facts with volume. Microphones became his weapon, cameras his army, social media his battlefield. But now silence. Donald Trump sat still, frozen, like a statue carved from ego and denial. The courtroom was deafeningly quiet, but the silence around him roared louder than anything he had ever tweeted. The man who once thundered about fake news and witch hunts, who made entire crowds chant his name, was now a man without a microphone, without a stage, without a script. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. He barely breathed. And yet every camera in the room focused on him like a hawk circling a wounded animal. Zoom in. His right hand, once used to sign executive orders and point fingers at journalists, now trembled faintly like a dead branch caught in a silent storm. His left thumb pressed hard into the table, as if trying to ground himself to reality. But it was too late. That reality had shifted. There was no crowd to cheer, no aide to whisper spin, no slogan to shout, no wall to hide behind. Just evidence. And Jasmine Crockett. The silence he sat in wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of collapse, of reckoning, of a man who finally heard the sound of consequences and had nothing left to say. Page after page, the story unfolded not with drama, but with deadly precision. Each document Jasmine Crockett pulled from the red folder felt like a blade slicing through decades of denial. Not rumors, not speculation, but evidence concrete, verifiable, and damning. There were financial records, thousands of them detailing offshore transactions, coded payments, and shell companies traced back to accounts in the Cayman Islands, Moscow, and Dubai. Each payment lined up perfectly with dates when sensitive U.S. military intelligence was leaked or foreign policy decisions mysteriously shifted. There were phone logs showing midnight calls to numbers linked to known foreign operatives, GPS data that placed Trump's closest advisors in private meetings that had never been disclosed to the public or to national security officials. There were emails, not from hackers or leakers, but obtained legally, subpoenaed and time-stamped. One in particular made the entire courtroom lean forward. He doesn't need to know where the file ends up, as long as we get the next deal through. A moment of stunned silence. Next, Crockett displayed an internal memo from a federal contractor flagging unusual access to satellite imaging platforms, access logged under Trump's personal clearance. The memo was dated 2 weeks before that same technology went offline and reappeared months later in the hands of a hostile foreign power. Then came the audio. A recording static at first, then unmistakable Trump's voice. What they don't know can't hurt them, and what they can't trace never happened. The room froze. Even Trump's attorneys stopped writing. Each click of a printer, each scanned fingerprint, each whispered call recorded by wiretap, each keystroke logged. Every one of them passed through multiple layers of verification, digital forensics chain of custody review authentication protocols, and every single one survived. Every delay tactic failed. Every denial shattered. What Jasmine revealed wasn't just criminal, it was surgical, and it left the defense with nothing but silence and sweat. They were the best money could buy. 5 attorneys, Ivy League pedigrees, decades of courtroom experience. A ARSM that included Supreme Court victories, international cases, and billion-dollar settlements. These weren't amateurs, they were gladiators in $1,000 suits. And now they sat in silence. No objections, no sidebar motions, no whispered strategies, just scribbles in legal pads they no longer believed in. One of them, Trump's lead counsel, had been known to crush witnesses with a single cross-examination. But now he simply stared at the open folder, eyes glazed, jaw clenched, pen shaking between his fingers. The courtroom had become a battlefield where only one side still had ammunition. Every time Jasmine placed another document on the screen, you could feel the last threads of their strategy unravel. Slowly, publicly, painfully. They weren't defending a client anymore, they were managing a collapse. And in the gallery, something began to shift. A woman in a red MAGA hat lowered her phone. A man in a veteran's jacket who had once donated his pension to the campaign slowly looked away. The spell was breaking. For years they had believed he was untouchable, unstoppable, that no matter what he said or did, he'd come out stronger. But today they watched their hero shrink behind a table while the law, cold and relentless, peeled back the myth layer by layer. This wasn't a witch hunt. This was a reckoning. And the men and women hired to protect him had already surrendered. She didn't need permission to speak. Jasmine Crockett rose from her chair with a kind of quiet gravity that made even the air hesitate. She didn't look left or right. She didn't need to. The whole room was already watching her, as if something holy was about to begin. No robe, no gavel, no seal behind her, and yet in that moment she held the weight of the Constitution like a judge, the authority of justice like a warrior, and the pain of her people like a prophet. Her voice didn't shake. She didn't read from a script. She didn't hide behind a podium. Her words came from someplace deeper, past law school, past politics, from lived truth. Your Honor, she began, what we decide in this courtroom today will echo far beyond these walls. Every person in that room felt it, not just the weight of the words, but the centuries packed into them. Words passed down from grandmothers who couldn't vote, from fathers who came home from war to be told they weren't equal, from children raised to believe justice was real even when it never showed up. She wasn't just speaking to a judge. She was speaking to history, and history listened. No hammer had to fall, no shouting was needed. Only her voice, and it was enough to pierce marble. Loyalty cannot be purchased with foreign gold. The courtroom didn't gasp, it inhaled, because in that one sentence she didn't just accuse corruption, she named betrayal. The kind that didn't wear ski masks or break windows. The kind that smiled in suits, signed papers, cashed checks, whispered to enemies while waving flags. She continued, her tone unwavering, each word sharpened by history and righteous anger. Justice is not a game to be negotiated behind closed doors. It is not a performance to be rehearsed for news cycles. It is the last thread between democracy and decay. And today, that thread is bleeding. Somewhere near the back, an aide dropped a pen. Up front, Trump's attorneys looked at each other, no longer strategizing, only surviving. Crockett wasn't trying to make headlines. She wasn't aiming for applause. She was issuing a national warning wrapped in courtroom language, but carrying the weight of a revolution. You asked how far we would go to expose the truth. She looked directly at Trump. Far enough to walk through the fire and drag your lies out with us. There was no defense motion, no interruption. Only the silence of a government on trial. At some point in every nation's story, a face steps out of the crowd and becomes something more. Not a politician, not a party member, not a soundbite, but a symbol. Jasmine Crockett didn't plan to become that symbol. She came into the courtroom armed with facts, law, and courage. But somewhere between the first document she presented and the final words she spoke, she became history. Not written history, living history. Her voice became the echo of every woman told to sit down. Her stance the answer to every boy taught that justice was not meant for them. Her presence the defiance of centuries that tried to erase her kind. From that moment forward, people no longer said, Congresswoman Crockett. They said, that's her. That's the woman who stood up when the country bent low. News anchors tried to label her. Strategists tried to spin her. But the truth was bigger than politics. She had become the face of something too powerful to control. A survivor, a warrior, a mirror, a reminder that justice has a heartbeat. Judge Henley didn't flinch. He sat behind the bench, his glasses perched low on the bridge of his nose, the gravity of what he was about to say pressing on his lungs like the weight of a collapsing nation. The courtroom held its breath. He looked straight at the defendant, the man who once ruled headlines, commanded rallies, shook hands with kings and dictators alike. And then he began to read. In consideration of the overwhelming evidence presented before this court, and in alignment with the statutes of the United States Constitution, each word was slow, deliberate, like the final strokes on a tombstone. The defendant is hereby sentenced to 75 years in federal custody. A stir rippled through the courtroom. Some gasped, others just stared, unable to process what they were witnessing. To be served at the ADX Florence facility under solitary confinement, 24 hours a day, no plea was made, no objection filed. Trump's face didn't move, but his eyes told another story, a quiet panic behind glassy defiance. Judge Henley did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just closed the folder, removed his glasses, and said what sounded like the toll of democracies, Final gavel court is adjourned. They call it the Alcatraz of the Rockies. But even that nickname doesn't capture the silence, the cold, the eternal sameness of every single day inside ADX Florence. For Donald Trump, the man who once held the nuclear codes, whose name once glowed in gold atop skyscrapers, it meant something far more brutal than a prison sentence. It meant erasure. The door to his cell slammed shut at exactly 6:02 p.m. No ceremonial last words, no cameras, just the metallic clunk of forever beginning. The room was concrete, 7 feet by 12, a narrow slit of a window barely big enough to tell the time of day, a toilet, a thin bed bolted to the floor, a desk no wider than a school book, no phone, no television, no internet, no visitors, and for 24 hours a day, no human contact. In his first 48 hours, he was not allowed to speak to a single soul. Even the guards communicated through a slot in the door. He was monitored, not acknowledged. He screamed the first night, called for lawyers, demanded cameras, shouted about fake news in deep states. No one answered. Not because they didn't hear him, but because they were trained not to. ADX Florence doesn't break your bones. It breaks your sense of time, of self, of being real. Trump, who once soared on private jets, now measured his world in inches of concrete and hours of silence. And somewhere behind those fortress thick walls, the man who once shouted into microphones across the globe now whispered only to himself. The cameras weren't supposed to be there, but they were. A courtroom sketch artist captured the stillness. A surveillance lens caught the tremble, and a national broadcast caught the fall. Donald Trump sat in silence, but the silence wasn't dignified. It was hollow. Sweat pooled at the collar of his once flawless suit. His complexion turned a shade paler with every word read aloud. His fingers twitched. His lips parted, no sound. For years, his image had been built on strength, on noise, on the illusion of control. But illusions have limits. The myth of the untouchable billionaire, the political warrior, the kingmaker, crumbled on live television. Somewhere between the phrase solitary confinement and ADX Florence, something behind his eyes gave out. A man doesn't need to faint to collapse. He just needs to stop believing in his own invincibility. And at that moment, Trump wasn't being crushed by the judge, the evidence, or the law. He was being crushed by something deeper, the realization that he could no longer outrun the truth. The gavel had barely fallen when the world reacted. From the parliament chambers in London to the news desks in Tokyo, from the cafes of Paris to the favelas of Brazil, the fall of Donald Trump sent shockwaves through every continent. Some leaders issued carefully worded statements. Others openly cried. Justice was tested and it stood tall, said German Chancellor Anke Lou, tears visibly welling in her eyes during a live broadcast. In South Africa, a university professor hugged his daughter and whispered, "They said the powerful never pay, but now they do." The streets of Dublin rang with car horns. Civilians in New Zealand organized candlelight vigils, not to celebrate but to mark the end of fear and disbelief. Even longtime U.S. allies who had remained diplomatic for years shared one common phrase in their press conferences: "We never thought we'd see this day." And on the front page of the Times in bold black letters, "America's last test passed." A headline that wasn't about revenge. It was about redemption. For the world, this wasn't just about Trump. It was about the idea that no man is above the law, not even the most powerful. The courtroom was empty. Cameras shut down. The buzz faded into hallway whispers. But Jasmine Crockett didn't smile, didn't raise a fist, didn't even look at the cameras. She simply reached forward, closed the red folder, and let her hand rest on its leather cover like she was sealing a tomb. Outside the courthouse window, the American flag fluttered in the wind, and for the first time in hours, Crockett allowed herself a moment of breath. "Aid, Congresswoman, they're ready for your statement." Crockett quietly, "There is no statement. There is only the law." She stood near the window, watching as protesters and patriots alike gathered below, shouting her name. But she didn't wave. She didn't go to the press conference. She didn't pose for headlines. She didn't let the moment become about her. "This wasn't my victory," she said later to a journalist who caught her on her way to the parking lot. "This was the law finally standing up for itself. No party, no champagne, just a quiet drive home and a nation forever changed." The flags didn't come down overnight. The bumper stickers weren't peeled off immediately. But something changed. In small towns across Ohio, Florida, and Wyoming, Men who once shouted his name now sat quietly in diners staring into cold coffee. Church halls fell silent. Veterans meetings paused for longer than usual. And in living rooms once decorated with red hats and campaign signs, there was a new sound silence followed by regret. Betty Carlson, sirs, 67, once hosted rallies in her backyard. She whispered to her neighbor, "I believed in him. I thought he cared, but all he cared about was himself." Tears didn't fall for Trump. They fell for the years lost, the family fights, the friendships broken over a man who never once looked back at them. A former Marine turned off the news and muttered, "He used us. We let him." In online forums once filled with fire and fury, a new thread emerged. Where do we go from here? No riots, no screams, just quiet heads lowered and hearts learning how to heal. As the headlines blazed his name, as hashtags trended and memes exploded across every feed, Jasmine Crockett sat in silence knowing the truth. This was never just about Trump. It wasn't just about one man in a suit who lied, manipulated, and climbed to power. It was about the system that let him do it, encouraged it, protected it, worshipped it. This trial wasn't a spectacle. It was a reckoning for decades of unchecked privilege, political theater, and betrayal of the American people. For every whistleblower ignored, every journalist discredited, every protester called radical, every minority voice drowned out in the noise of greatness. This moment said, enough. It was a verdict for the mother in Detroit who lost her health care, the farmer in Iowa drowned in debt, the black teen wrongfully arrested in Mississippi. The gavel may have landed on Trump's fate, but the echo reached every corner of a broken republic. This wasn't about taking down a man. It was about standing up for a nation's soul. She didn't want a statue. She didn't want her name etched in stone or echoed in chants. What Jasmine Crockett wanted, what she bled for, was something quieter, something harder, something more lasting. Democracy doesn't survive by luck, she said at the end of her closing remarks. It survives because people choose to protect it even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. And she knew what hard looked like. She had tasted it in courtroom stares, media smears, and threats left on her voicemail. She had carried it in every document. She read every name she cleared, every lie she dismantled. Her words weren't for headlines. They were for the single mother too tired to vote, for the factory worker who lost faith in the system, for the teenager who wondered if justice ever really existed at all. You don't protect democracy by waiting for heroes, she said. You protect it by becoming one. Then she stepped down from the podium, closed the red folder one last time, and walked out not like a victor, but like a guardian. No gavel slammed, no anthem played, no cheers erupted. The courtroom emptied in utter silence, not out of fear, but out of something deeper: awe, respect, reverence. The cameras panned across faces, judges, journalists, citizens, all motionless, all stunned, as if they had just witnessed not a trial but a rebirth. Some wept. Others stared at the ground, rebuilding their sense of truth one breath at a time. Outside, the American flag fluttered in the breeze. But it looked different now, not because the fabric changed, but because the eyes watching it had. This wasn't just the fall of a man. It was the rise of a people. A country that had wandered through lies, through shadows, through noise, had just found its way back to the light. And in that moment, for just a heartbeat, the world went still. This story isn't just about Donald Trump, Jasmine Crockett, or even a courtroom. It's about us ordinary people. It reminds us that justice doesn't appear overnight. It takes courage, persistence, and the willingness to stand tall even when the world tries to push you down. In life, we all face our own trials, moments when lies seem louder than truth, when the powerful try to silence the weak. But remember this, no empire of deception lasts forever. Truth has a way of cutting through the noise as long as someone dares to carry it forward. The lesson is simple yet timeless. Never underestimate the power of one voice backed by truth and integrity to change the course of history. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the importance of truth, justice, and standing up for what's right, then don't just scroll away. Join our community, hit that subscribe button, and turn on the notification bell, because here we uncover the stories that others are too afraid to tell. Together we can make sure that justice, truth, and hope always have a voice.